everybody. I'm Dr. Matt Munger. Welcome to another episode of The Bible Was Written Backwards, where I look at the ways in which the Bible uses earlier traditions, ideas, and stories and rewrites, adapts, and retells those stories within the text of the Bible itself. Today, I want to look at the story of the history of Israel as we find it in the pages of the Bible. This will be the first of two videos where we look at this topic. Today, I want to look at the so-called Deuteronomistic history, which stretches from the book of Joshua through the book of 2 Kings in the Hebrew Bible. Next time, we'll be looking at the book of Chronicles, which takes the latter part of this story found in the books of Samuel and Kings and readapts that to a new context. The histories of Israel, as found in the Bible, are some of the most obvious and most often overlooked examples of the backward-facing writing of the biblical text. This is because history, as a rule, is written backwards, looking back at the events of the past and examining them and explaining them to readers in the present. This seems to be forgotten when readers expect writings to explain exactly what happened in history, instead of being the perspective of the author or authors about what they think happened and why. In the academic lingo, we talk about this being the difference between history and historiography. History is more or less what happened in the past, or at least the study of what happened in the past. Whether or not we can actually know what happened in the past is debatable. But historiography is the writing of history and the study of the writing of history. We need to know what influenced the writing of history in order to understand the text itself, meaning that we need to know something about the context of the composition, not only of the period that the history is trying to explain. You should be aware that what I'm doing here is looking at historiography. I'm interested in how the text was written and what influenced that writing. So, as I said at the beginning of the video, I want to look at two separate historiographical works in the Hebrew Bible from this perspective. Today, we're going to be looking at the Deuteronomistic history, which is the name given for the books from Joshua through 2 Kings, and in another video, we'll look at the book of Chronicles from the same perspective. Now, let's delve into the texts. The Deuteronomistic history, the story of Israel found in the books of Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings, has a fascinating history of research. On the one hand, the name the Deuteronomistic history was first coined in 1943 by German scholar Martin Noth. On the other hand, these books have been collected and titled the former prophets in Jewish context since the Middle Ages, and intuitively, it's obvious that these tell the story of the Israelite conquest of Canaan through the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. The name Deuteronomistic comes from the idea that the history is closely related to the composition of and theology found in the book of Deuteronomy. The idea of the Deuteronomistic history as a coherent document, stretching from Joshua through 2 Kings, makes sense from a literary perspective. This was acknowledged long before Martin Noth made his observation of the unity of the work. Earlier scholars had seen how there is a clear continuity in the narrative between the books, but they tended to focus on the relationship of Deuteronomy with Joshua rather than on the continuity of Joshua and the following narratives. What Noth proposed was that the entire work stretching from Joshua through 2 Kings was part of a grand narrative that was edited after the beginning of the Babylonian exile. More precisely, after the release of King Jehoiakim from prison in Babylon in 562 BCE, which is the final passage of 2 Kings. Noth understood the history composed by the Deuteronomistic historian as trying to explain why Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians, creating a grand narrative from the conquest to the fall. The driving interpretive lens was the correct worship of God in, and only in, Jerusalem, and the major events of the story were marked by speeches held by the main characters. This literary and theological unity very quickly found acceptance among the scholars, and the Deuteronomistic history as a unit was born. This itself is a historiographical perspective. What Noth is doing here is asking the question, what historical perspective did the author, composer, collector of these stories have And when can we find a place for that to have taken place? In historical context, it makes sense to say that the first possible time for this would be after the events that are described in the last part of the work. And so it makes sense from Knott's perspective to say that the historiographical context of the writing of this history would have been in the Babylonian exile just after the fall of Jerusalem. In terms of literary style, the most important feature is the framing of history with the ideological speeches by the protagonists and the narrator. Some of the framing passages are Joshua 1, 1 through 9, and 23, 1 through 16, Judges 2, 11 through 3, 6, 1 Samuel 12, 1 through 15, 1 Kings 8, 14 to 53, 2 Kings 17, 7 to 23, and 2 Kings 24, 1 through 7. These texts clearly share similar ideological and historiographical contexts and represent the main epochs in the history of Israel as envisioned by the composer of the text. These are the conquest, the time of the judges, the united monarchy, the divided kingdom, until the fall of Samaria, and the final days of Judah. Now, I want to look at some of these texts so that we can get a feel for what's going on here. What we'll see is that there are 3 or 4 very important themes that will show up in a number of these texts. One is, of course, the obedience to God and his law. Second is the correct worship of God, which is done in a couple of ways. One, it is found in Jerusalem, which, of course, once the story gets there, is the most important part. Another important part of the correct worship of God was the avoidance of other gods. And this is achieved by either removing or destroying all of the other gods and all the people that worship those gods. So we'll be looking for these themes as we read through these passages. Let's look at parts of these texts. First, in Joshua 1, we read the following.
After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, My servant Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the Israelites. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and the Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, to the great sea in the west shall be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with all the law that my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you may be successful wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful. I hereby command you, be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go.
Here in Joshua chapter 1, it is God who speaks to Joshua. The message is very clear. The conquest of the land is explicitly connected to the book of the law and faithfully keeping it. Compare this with the end of the book in Joshua 23, where it is Joshua who makes a speech for Israel.
A long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies all around, and Joshua was old and well advanced in years, Joshua summoned all Israel, their elders and heads, their judges and officers, and said to them, I am now old and well advanced in years, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake, for it is the Lord your God who has fought for you. Therefore be very steadfast to observe and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right nor to the left, so that you may not be mixed with these nations left here among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow yourselves down to them, but hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day.
This passage picks up on themes of obedience to the laws of God, but also includes another important theme, avoiding relations with the nations of the land. This is the second major theme of the Deuteronomistic history. The book of Judges also opens with a passage that connects keeping the commandments of God with success in military matters. This time in the negative, as the angel of the Lord accuses the Israelites of not keeping the commands. This theme outlines the entire book of Judges, constantly reminding the reader that Israel should worship only God and should avoid or kill the people around them. And if they do so, they'll be rewarded, but if they don't, they'll be punished. The transition to the monarchy is also marked by a speech in 1 Samuel 12, and this shares these common themes of obedience to the law and avoiding the nations of the land of Canaan. 1 Kings 8, however, marks the climax of the story of the united kingdom of David and Solomon. This is Solomon's inauguration of the new temple for God. This chapter is split between Solomon's speech and a prayer. Parts of both are worth looking at here. First, in the speech to the people of Israel, Solomon connects the building of the temple to the long story from Moses to David.
Then the king turned around and blessed all the assembly of Israel, while all the assembly of Israel stood. He said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his hand has fulfilled what he promised with his mouth to my father David, saying, Since the day that I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city from any of the tribes of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there. But I chose David to be over my people Israel. My father David had it in mind to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father David, You did well to consider building a house for my name. Nevertheless, you shall not build the house, but your son who shall be born to you shall build the house for my name. Now the Lord has upheld the promise that he made, for I have risen in the place of my father David. I sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised, and have built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. There I have provided a place for the ark, in which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with our ancestors when he brought them out of the land of Egypt.
Then in a prayer, Solomon outlines what will come.
If your people go out to battle against their enemy, by whatever way you shall send them, and they pray to the Lord toward the city that you have chosen and the house that I have built for your name, then hear in heaven their prayer and their plea, and maintain their cause. If they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you are angry with them and give them to an enemy, so that they are carried away captive to the land of the enemy, far off or near, yet if they come to their senses in the land to which they have been taken captive, and repent and plead with you in the land of their captors, saying, We have sinned and have done wrong, we have acted wickedly. If they repent with all their heart and soul in the land of their enemies, who took them captive, and pray to you toward their land, which you gave to their ancestors, the city that you have chosen, and the house that I have built for your name. Then hear in heaven your dwelling place their prayer and their plea. Maintain their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you, and all their transgressions that they have committed against you. And grant them compassion in the sight of their captors, so that they may have compassion on them. For they are your people and heritage, which you brought out of Egypt, from the midst of the iron smelter. Let your eyes be open to the plea of your servant, and to the plea of your people Israel, listening to them whenever they call to you. For you have separated them from among all the peoples of the earth, to be your heritage, just as you promised through Moses, your servant, when you brought our ancestors out of Egypt, O Lord God.
The speech and prayer of Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 8 build on the same themes of obedience, but include a third important theme that binds together the Deuteronomistic history, the importance of Jerusalem as the chosen place for God's residence on earth. Finally, when we look at the book of 2 Kings, we find two texts that explain the downfall of the two kingdoms of Israel in the same terms as the speeches we find in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and 1 Kings. The first is the story of the destruction of Samaria by the Assyrians.
Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria. For 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He carried the Israelites away to Assyria. He placed them in Halah, on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They had worshipped other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had introduced. The people of Israel secretly did things that were not right against the Lord their God. They built for themselves high places at all their towns, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves pillars and sacred poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did whom the Lord carried away before them. They did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. They served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, "You shall not do this."
The second is found in 2 Kings 24, where the destruction of Judah by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon is described.
In his days, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came up. Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. The Lord sent against him bands of the Chaldeans, bands of the Arameans, bands of the Moabites, and bands of the Ammonites. He sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servants the prophets. Surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord, to remove them out of his sight, for the sins of Manasseh, for all that he had committed, and also for the innocent blood that he had shed. For he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord was not willing to pardon. Now the rest of the deeds of Jehoiakim, and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? So Jehoiakim slept with his ancestors. Then his son, Jehoiakim, succeeded him. The king of Egypt did not come again out of his land, for the king of Babylon had taken over all that belonged to the king of Egypt, from the Wadi of Egypt to the river Euphrates.
The point of looking at all of these texts is to illustrate that there is an overarching historiographical perspective that binds the history together. First, the obedience of the people to God and his commands is directly related to their military success and the stability of the nation. Second, avoiding mixing with the nations inhabiting the land is of major importance. Third, Jerusalem is the chosen place of God. The principles for this are laid out at the beginning of the Deuteronomic Code, which outlines the specific terms of the covenant that is used as a standard for judgment throughout the Deuteronomistic history. But here, we are, in the literary sense, before the Deuteronomistic history. We're in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 12.
These are the statutes and ordinances that you must diligently observe in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to occupy all the days that you live on the earth. You must demolish completely all the places where the nations whom you are about to dispossess served their gods, on the mountain heights, on the hills, and under every leafy tree. Break down their altars, smash their pillars, burn their sacred poles with fire, and hew down the idols of their gods, and thus blot out their name from their places. You shall not worship the Lord your God in such ways, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes as his habitation to put his name there.
As we see, these are not just major themes in the story from Joshua to 2 Kings, but they are also the most important themes in the book of Deuteronomy. This connection between the historiographical perspective of Joshua to 2 Kings and the legislature of Deuteronomy is where we get the phrase the Deuteronomistic history. Thus, if we take the ideological statements found in Deuteronomy as normative, meaning that the laws and expectations for the people within the covenant of God, then one would think that Israel is aware of and bound to a set of laws that are relatively easy to understand, the most basic formulation of which amounts to, don't worship other gods and only worship God in his chosen place. However, the narratives of all of the texts between Deuteronomy and 2 Kings tell the story of how Israel actually never consistently worshipped only God in one place, during this period. So the reality of the Israelite religion before the exile seems to be that a number of gods were in the religious landscape, and a number of places to worship were also available. It is the historiographical perspective of the composer of the Deuteronomistic history that imposes the narrative framework of everything being judged based on these principles. What is the point of structuring the narrative in this way? I want to approach this question by returning to Noth's theory of the Deuteronomistic history, which was built on and revised in slightly different ways by scholars who sought to explain some tensions that appear when interpreting the Deuteronomistic history as a singular composition. Frank Moore Cross, an American biblical scholar, revised Noth's theory by observing that there is a layer of text that is more likely related to an earlier time before the exile, during the reign of Josiah of Judah. Cross then explains that the entire history was revised again after the fall of Jerusalem, finding its final form in the same context described by Noth. Cross's theory is helpful because it explains a feature of the Deuteronomistic history that is difficult to make sense of following Noth's model, namely the reform of Joshua in 2 Kings 23. Basically, 2 Kings 23 outlines how King Josiah sets in motion a reform of the religious practices of Judah that corresponds to the laws of Deuteronomy and the overall framework of the Deuteronomistic history. After finding a book of the law in the temple, Josiah orders all worship of other gods to cease, and for all places of worship to be destroyed, except the temple in Jerusalem. This reform is one of the only high points in the story after Solomon, and fits perfectly within the framework of the earlier history. Cross then sees the earliest version of the Deuteronomistic history as having come from the time of Josiah, being closely related to the reform of Josiah and the purported finding of the book of the law in the temple. A different revision of Noth's theory was proposed by Rudolf Smend, who, like Cross, saw the redaction in the text of the Deuteronomistic history that would have to correspond to different historical periods. His solution, however, was to place those revisions during and after the exile, in contrast to Cross, who saw a pre-exilic version. This view, in a number of different iterations, became the most influential understanding of the theory of the Deuteronomistic history in Europe during the last quarter of the 20th century. Smend saw several seams in the text, and noted that there were many places that both assumed the exile and also a more settled community in exile, which would require multiple exilic redactions. More recently, Thomas Romer has proposed a solution to the competing interpretation of Noth's Deuteronomistic history, allowing for a threefold edition of the Deuteronomistic library. The first layer has its historical context in Judah at the time of the reform of King Josiah, and was created as a propaganda text for these royal reforms. This edition ended at 2 Kings 23:25, which parallels Deuteronomy 6:4-5, which is taken to be the original beginning of the Deuteronomistic history. The idea that this layer of the Deuteronomistic history is a sort of propaganda text for Judah and Josiah has been around for a while and makes sense in this context. The context of a grand narrative about the origins and development of the nation, put in simple terms so that people understand the purpose of legislature, does seem to be a relevant context for the writing of this history. Furthermore, several scholars have pointed to parallels between Joshua and Josiah, where we might interpret Joshua as the national hero that is meant to foreshadow Josiah and give legitimacy to the reforms and actions of the king. The second layer of the Deuteronomistic history, according to Romer, comes from the time of the exile and is a revision of the earlier history in light of the Babylonian exile. This edition ends with 2 Kings 25:21.
Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, took them and brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. The king of Babylon struck them down and put them to death at Riblah in the land of Hamath. So Judah went into exile out of its land.
In Romer's opinion, the third and final layer, which is the text as we now have it, was created by a revision during the Persian period, so after 542 BCE, and ends with the release of King Jehoiakim from prison in 2 Kings 25:27 through 30.
In the 37th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, King Evil-Merodach of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, released King Jehoiakim of Judah from prison. He spoke kindly to him, and gave him a seat above the other seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put aside his prison clothes. Every day of his life he dined regularly in the king's presence. For his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king, a portion every day, as long as he lived.
This is seen as an indication that there is an acceptance of the situation of the exile and a movement towards integration that can be found in a number of other biblical passages from the Persian period. Romer shows here that this process is evident in some of the key Deuteronomistic passages in the history. We can look at one of them, which we already looked at a bit, 1 Kings 8. Romer sees here an original layer that is very positive to the temple and its place in Israel's history, corresponding to the Josianic optimism and reform. This is found in 1 Kings 8:14-21, where Solomon addresses the people and explains the significance of the temple being built in the place God had chosen. The second layer, from the exilic period, adds verses 22-40, 46-51, and 54-57. This is most obvious in 1 Kings 8:33-34, which is a prayer to bring the people back to the land.
When your people Israel, having sinned against you, are defeated before an enemy, but turn again to you, confess your name, pray and plead with you in this house, then hear in heaven, forgive the sin of your people Israel, and bring them again to the land that you gave to their ancestors.
Finally, the last layer adds texts such as 1 Kings 8:52-53 and 57-61. The end of this passage is worth looking at in detail because it shows that even in this text that is literally about the inauguration of the temple, the redactor has put in indications that the idea of the temple has been replaced with the idea of keeping God's commandments as central to the covenant.
The Lord our God be with us, as he was with our ancestors. May he not leave us or abandon us, but incline our hearts to him, to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, his statutes, and his ordinances, which he commanded our ancestors. Let these words of mine, with which I pleaded before the Lord, be near to the Lord our God day and night. And may he maintain the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel, as each day requires, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God, there is no other. Therefore, devote yourselves completely to the Lord our God, walking in his statutes and keeping his commandments, as at this day.
The most important conclusion that we reach from evaluating the historiographical tendencies of the author-composer of the text of Joshua to Kings is that they share a framework for evaluating history. This framework is laid out in the book of Deuteronomy and reiterated at key points throughout the history of Israel. Again, as with the stories of the patriarchs, Moses, and the law, I think that the reading of these texts as receptions of earlier traditions helps us make sense of what the text is doing. Debates about the historicity of the events in the text from Joshua all the way up to the fall of Judah and the exile are in many cases futile. But it seems very likely that at the time of the composition of the Deuteronomistic history, there were many traditions about the past that were brought together. Ideas of the conquest in the time of Judges, prophets Samuel, Nathan, Elijah, and Elisha, not to mention the kings of Israel and Judah, must have been ideas that were available to the composer of the history in some way. But what we have is crafted by a Judahite composer and redactors of history who created a national history that already knew the end of the story. And thus, they were literally writing the Bible looking backwards.